They tried to shame me for docking my own boat, on the lake I legally owned. I gave them a chance to back off, but they pushed. So I reminded them what real ownership, and respect, looks like. It all started the day I held the keys to a home I never thought I'd truly earn. Not because I wasn't willing to work for it, but because life has a way of stacking hurdles in front of you just when you think you've got it figured out. This house, nestled deep in a quiet neighborhood framed by pines and gentle hills, wasn't flashy or oversized. It didn't need to be. What made it special wasn't just the wide porch that wrapped around the front, or the way the sun lit the kitchen in the morning. It was the view out back. A private lake stretched behind the property, still and silver like a mirror in the early hours, tucked in just enough to feel like the world had forgotten about it. It wasn't just beautiful. It was healing. The kind of place a man dreams of retiring to after decades of hard work, raising a family, paying taxes, doing right even when the world didn't always return the favor. It was quiet. Honest. The kind of quiet that doesn't beg for your attention but rewards your presence. The kind of place that brings your blood pressure down and reminds you that peace isn't a luxury. It's a right earned through a life of dignity and decency. When I bought the house, the listing mentioned lakefront access. But after a few long talks with the seller and a deep dive into the property paperwork, I discovered something that surprised even me. The lake wasn't public. It wasn't owned by the HOA. It wasn't split among neighbors. It was deeded entirely to the property I had just bought. That meant every ripple, every cattail, every base swimming beneath the surface belonged legally to me. Full rights, every inch. And I'll tell you, as a man who spent years living paycheck to paycheck, who watched companies downsize and friends lose pensions, who buried loved ones and kept showing up to work anyway, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing I'd earned this lake. Not borrowed, not rented, owned. And I had plans. Not big ones, not loud ones, just simple ones. A little fishing now and then, maybe teaching my grandson how to cast a line this summer, morning coffee by the water, the kind of peaceful routines you picture but rarely get to live. I had an old fishing boat, modest but well kept, that I docked near the edge of the lake, tethered to a small wooden post I hammered in myself. I'd walk out in the early light, sit on that boat with my coffee, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had space to breathe. But it didn't take long before that peace started to crack. First it was the glances from neighbors, friendly enough but curious. Then came the questions. Is that your boat out there? Did you get permission from the HOA? At first I laughed them off. I explained politely that the lake was mine, that it came with the house. I even offered to show the paperwork, thinking we'd all have a laugh and move on. But the mood shifted. What started as friendly curiosity turned colder, more formal. It was as if my quiet retreat had somehow offended the unspoken rules of the neighborhood. And then one afternoon, I came back from town and found a notice taped to the side of my boat. Bright orange, official looking. Violation, unauthorized, watercraft, must be removed within 7 days. I stared at it, heart pounding, not with fear but disbelief. This was my boat, my lake. I paid for every inch of it with money I'd earned the hard way. I'd spent a lifetime showing respect to others, working within the system, never asking for more than what was fair. And now here I was, being treated like a trespasser in my own backyard. It felt like an insult, not just to me, but to everything I'd worked for. And to be honest, it hurt. There's a kind of dignity that comes with building something from nothing, with living within your means and holding your head high even when things get hard. I hadn't cut corners. I hadn't cheated or lied or pulled any favors. I'd done it the right way. And yet somehow that still wasn't enough to be left alone. They saw a boat, assumed it didn't belong, and slapped me with a threat. No questions, no conversation, just a notice. And in that moment, I realized, some people don't care about truth, or fairness, or even the law. They care about control. And I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for a boat. I was standing up for the principle that a man's home, his peace, his dignity, still matter. If this kind of story speaks to you, stories where justice matters, where doing the right thing still counts for something, take a second and subscribe. This channel isn't about drama or hype. It's about real people, real struggles, and the quiet strength it takes to hold your ground in a world that doesn't always make room for it. I share stories like this because I believe they still mean something, and if you do too, I hope you'll stick around. But back to the lake. A few days after that first notice, I saw them. 3 HOA board members standing by the water, pointing at my boat, taking pictures. One of them even had a clipboard. That's when I knew they weren't going to let this go quietly. And what I found out next about what they'd been doing on my lake without my permission nearly knocked the wind out of me. When I first saw that bright orange notice flapping on the side of my boat, my gut instinct was to chuckle. Surely it had to be some mix-up, a mistake made by someone new on the HOA board who didn't know what they were talking about. But as I read the words, violation of HOA guidelines, unauthorized watercraft must be removed within 7 days, my stomach tightened, and a strange kind of heaviness settled in my chest. It wasn't just the notice itself, it was the tone. Cold, dismissive. Like I was some reckless teenager being scolded for parking in the wrong spot, not a man in his 60s who'd spent a lifetime earning the right to a little peace and quiet. I stood there for a long moment, the grocery bag still in my hands, watching that paper rustle in the wind, feeling like someone had kicked dust on my front porch. I didn't remember signing anything about an HOA, and I sure as hell hadn't agreed to let anyone tell me what I could or couldn't do on a lake I legally owned. But even then, I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe they'd overlooked something in the records. Maybe they assumed the lake was part of the community's common property. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I stayed calm. I went into my study, pulled out the thick folder of paperwork I'd kept neatly filed ever since closing day, and laid everything out on the desk. There it was, clear as day. The lake, all 7.3 acres of it, was deeded solely to my parcel. Not shared, not communal, not subject to HOA guidelines. It was my name on that title, and that lake came with it just like the roof over my head and the ground beneath my feet. Still, wanting to avoid conflict, I scanned the deed and sent a polite email to the HOA board, explaining the mistake and attaching the official documents. I even offered to meet in person to clear things up. I waited 2 days. Their response? A short clipped reply that didn't even acknowledge the documents I'd sent. Instead, it simply said, "The lake is a shared community feature and is under HOA regulation. All boats must be pre-approved. Please remove your vessel by the deadline or face daily fines." That was it. No greeting. No thank you. No recognition of the legal proof I'd offered. I sat back in my chair, rereading it twice, trying to make sense of the tone, of the sheer arrogance of it. They hadn't even tried to be neighborly. And that's when something started to stir in me. A sense of unease. Not just because I was being wrongly accused, but because they didn't care about the truth. They didn't want to talk. They wanted to control. Over the next few days, I noticed things. Little things, but they built up. I'd come out early in the morning, coffee in hand, and spot people walking slower past my backyard, craning their necks toward the boat like it was some kind of crime scene. I even caught one man taking pictures with his phone. Another time, I overheard 2 board members chatting across the street, and one said loud enough for me to hear, "We can't have him thinking he's above the rules." That's when the insult started to cut deeper. This wasn't just about a boat. It was about being told that the sweat, sacrifice, and straight-backed living that got me here somehow didn't matter. Like I was just another box to check off on their violation list. And it hurt in a way I didn't expect, because I'd lived through enough to know what real disrespect feels like. I've been laid off without warning, seen friends pushed aside after decades of loyalty, watched my father work his knuckles raw only to be dismissed by people who never lifted a shovel in their lives. I know that kind of disregard. And now, it was showing up again, this time in my backyard, dressed in HOA letterhead. I tried once more to reason with them, this time bringing my attorney into the loop, not to threaten, just to show I wasn't going to be steamrolled. But the HOA board doubled down. They issued a second notice, this one more severe, stating that non-compliance would result in further escalation, including legal involvement. And that's when I started digging into the HOA itself. I wanted to understand who exactly was behind this campaign. What I found made my jaw tighten. Not only had the HOA been assuming ownership of the lake for years, but they'd been running a private fishing club on my lake, charging membership fees to residents, and even a few non-residents from neighboring communities. They hosted weekend tournaments, advertised through a private Facebook group, and collected dues that by all appearances weren't going toward anything other than their own little clique's weekend fun. And they never once sought permission from the legal owner, me. They didn't just think the lake was theirs. They were profiting off it. I sat at my desk that night, staring at photos of their fishing events, at posts bragging about record base, catches and registration fees, and I felt a slow, quiet burn in my chest. Not rage, not yet, but something older, deeper, a kind of betrayal. because I'd come here to find peace, to build something honest, and these people had treated me like a nuisance while quietly using what I owned as if it were theirs. And, the worst part, they didn't care who got hurt, as long as they kept control. I looked out the window at my little boat, gently bobbing in the water under the moonlight, and I thought of my grandson. How he'd been excited to visit this summer, how he'd planned to fish off that dock, just like I used to do with my dad. And I realized, if I let this go, if I let them bully me off my own land, what message was I sending? That truth doesn't matter. That you can do everything right and still be told to sit down and shut up. That a man's rights end where someone else's opinion begins. I couldn't accept that. I wouldn't. And just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, just when I was preparing to confront them face to face, I received a letter slipped under my front door. No envelope, no stamp, just one sheet of paper, typed in bold, centered font. Failure to comply will result in forced removal of property. They weren't talking about the boat anymore. The week after I sent them the deed, the actual legal document showing clear ownership, they didn't respond with an apology or even a simple acknowledgement. Instead, I saw them standing at the edge of the lake one afternoon. 3 members of the HOA board, clipboards in hand, cell phones raised like they were investigating a crime scene. My boat sat there peacefully, same as always. But now it was a target, a symbol they were trying to tear down. And then, just like clockwork, another letter came that weekend. This time printed in thick red ink with aggressive wording that practically dripped with arrogance. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines, legal proceedings, and potential removal of unauthorized property. But what stopped me cold was the added line. The boat in question has been cited as disruptive to the neighborhood fishing experience and lowers the aesthetic value of our shared waterfront. Shared waterfront. Disruptive. That's when I started to realize this wasn't just about rules. This was about image, control, a power grab wrapped in the language of community standards. The hypocrisy was staggering. Here they were, complaining that my boat was disturbing their fishing club, on my lake. A club I had never been asked about, let alone approved. That was the breaking point. I couldn't shake the feeling that something much deeper was going on here. So I started to investigate. Quietly. I went online, dug through public records, tracked back HOA meeting minutes, old newsletters, and photos residents had posted to Facebook over the years. What I found left me stunned. For at least the past 8 years, the HOA had been operating a weekend fishing club that hosted events on the lake, complete with sign-ups, entry fees, even catered food for their little tournaments. They were charging membership dues not only from residents, but from people in neighboring communities too. They posted trophy pictures, gave out prizes, and in some cases even rented boats and gear, for a fee. All of it, quietly tucked behind closed doors, all without so much as a conversation with the person who actually owned the body of water they were profiting from. Me. I had unknowingly been subsidizing their little side business from the moment I bought this property, and instead of coming clean or showing gratitude, they had the nerve to call my property an eyesore. I felt sick to my stomach, not just because of the dishonesty, but because I realized they were willing to attack and discredit me to preserve their illusion of authority. They weren't just ignoring my rights, they were actively trying to erase them. I reached out one more time, calmly but firmly, laying out the legal reality. I included photos of the deed, a map outlining the lake boundary, screenshots of their fishing club promotions, even a breakdown of their event schedule. I made it clear that they were trespassing, making a profit off private property, and had no legal standing to regulate anything on the water. I told them I didn't want to escalate the situation, but they had to cease their use of the lake and remove all references to their fishing club immediately. Days passed. No reply. Then a new notice appeared, this time hand-delivered, slipped into my mailbox with no signature. It accused me of threatening the community with baseless claims, and said if I continued to harass the HOA board, they would file a restraining order. A restraining order. For defending my own property. I stood on the porch that evening, holding that notice in my hands, watching the sun dip behind the trees as the light shimmered off the lake. This place had been my dream, my reward for decades of hard work, and now it felt like a battlefield. All because a handful of self-important neighbors decided they could rewrite the truth to fit their own convenience. I started getting sideways, glances from people I used to wave to every morning. One woman who used to walk her dog past my house crossed the street when she saw me. The tension was thick, and it was clear the HOA had started whispering things, painting me as some kind of troublemaker, a threat to the harmony of the neighborhood. And yet, none of them had the courage to speak to me directly. They just hid behind notices and emails hoping I'd get tired, give up, and go away. But I couldn't. Not just for me, but for what it represented. Because if they could get away with this, if they could take what was yours, rewrite the rules, and then punish you for standing up, they'd do it again. To someone else. Maybe someone who didn't have the means or the strength to push back. That's when I knew I had to act, not just defend myself, but expose them. So I called my attorney, handed him everything I'd collected, and we began the process of drafting formal cease and desist notices, along with a clear demand: disband the fishing club, cease all activity on the lake, and issue a written apology. Or, we'd file a civil suit for trespassing, unauthorized use of private property, and emotional distress. I didn't want it to come to that, but their silence had given me no choice. Just when I thought we'd reached peak absurdity, the HOA fired back with a letter claiming I was mistaken, that the lake had been functionally shared for so long it was now communal by tradition, and therefore fell under their purview, tradition. As if repeated trespassing somehow rewrote the law. That same week, they hosted another fishing event, this time with more guests, more boats, and louder music, like they were daring me to respond. And I did. I sent my attorney down there with official papers in hand. But what happened next left even him speechless. When he approached the group to deliver the documents, one of the board members, someone I'd seen at holiday parties and block cookouts, told him flatly, "This isn't your lake anymore. It belongs to the people now." That moment when I heard the words, "This isn't your lake anymore. It belongs to the people now," something deep inside me snapped, not in anger, but in resolve. I'd spent months trying to be reasonable, offering patience when I should have, drawn a line, and giving the benefit of the doubt when I should have demanded respect. But that was over. I drove straight home, dug out every last piece of documentation I had, the deed, surveys, property boundary maps, zoning laws, and made an appointment with my real estate attorney first thing the next morning. He was a sharp, no-nonsense guy who had handled land disputes for decades, and after reviewing everything he leaned back in his chair, looked me square in the eye and said, "You own that lake outright. They're not just trespassing. They're profiting off your private property and issuing threats with zero legal basis. You have every right to shut them down." That was all I needed to hear. The gloves were off. We drafted a cease and desist letter, not just to the HOA but individually addressed to each board member by name, outlining every incident, every false notice, and every instance of unauthorized use of the lake. We attached copies of the deed, photographic evidence, screenshots of their fishing club promotions, and a formal warning: continue this activity, and we will file for civil damages, including but not limited to trespassing, illegal profit-making on private land, and harassment. My attorney even suggested that I might have grounds for a slander claim given how they'd been spreading misinformation about me around the neighborhood. I had the letters printed, sealed, and delivered via certified mail and hand delivery for maximum impact. And while I waited for the fallout, I took another step. I installed clear, polite signage around the lake's perimeter. Private property, lake use by written permission only, no trespassing. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't rude, but it was undeniable. And then I sent one last email directly to the HOA board. My boat stays, your fishing club goes, end of discussion. And then, silence. Not another email, not another warning note, not even a whisper of resistance. It was as if the entire board had collectively realized the game was up. By the end of the week, the signs of retreat were everywhere. The usual Saturday gathering vanished. The fishing club's flyers were taken down. The Facebook group they'd used to coordinate events was suddenly wiped clean of all posts. One by one, the club members stopped coming to the lake. Even the most vocal ones, those who used to strut around with fishing rods and lawn chairs like they owned the place, disappeared without so much as a word. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. But I did feel something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. For the first time since moving into what was supposed to be my dream home, I could stand on my back porch, look out over the water, and feel like it was truly mine. The boat stayed right where it belonged, gently bobbing on the surface like a quiet reminder that dignity matters, that truth holds power, and that when you fight with honor, you don't always need to raise your voice to win. But just when I thought it was over, just as I was starting to relax and enjoy my quiet mornings again, something unexpected arrived in the mail. A letter. Handwritten. Not from the HOA. Not from a neighbor. But from someone I never would have imagined hearing from. Since that letter arrived, things felt different. Not just quieter around the lake, but something deeper. Something that settled inside me. The note was from an older gentleman who used to be one of the founding members of the neighborhood's fishing club. He'd lived down the street for years, and I remembered seeing him by the lake almost every weekend before all this mess started. In his letter, he apologized. Said he never knew the lake was privately owned. That if he had, he never would have taken part in the club's events, and certainly not supported the HOA in their push to get me out. He thanked me for standing my ground, and called me a man of quiet dignity, a phrase that stuck with me far more than he probably intended. And after that, it was like the whole neighborhood gradually shifted its tone. The confrontational energy faded. People began nodding again when they passed me on walks. Some even stopped to chat a bit, asking how the fishing was or if I needed help carrying gear down to the boat. It didn't erase what happened, and it didn't change the fact that for months, I felt like a stranger in the very place I called home. But it felt like something healing had begun. Not just around me, but inside me too. I started spending more time on the lake, often just floating in the boat with a coffee in hand, letting the sun warm my face while I listened to the wind move through the trees. There's a clarity that comes when life slows down again, when you're no longer looking over your shoulder or wondering what ridiculous letter will show up next. That clarity reminded me of why I worked so hard all those years to get here. It wasn't just the house or even the lake. It was the right to live in peace, to enjoy what I'd built, and to not be pushed around just because someone decided. Their clipboard and committee title gave them more say than the law itself. In the end, the HOA never responded to my final letter. No apology, no admission, just silence. And maybe that was for the best. Because sometimes dignity doesn't come with a confrontation. It comes with the quiet decision to stand firm, to know who you are and what you've earned, and to let the truth speak louder than any argument ever could. I learned that justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the stillness of a lake no one else is trying to claim anymore. And now, as the seasons change and the water glistens under golden morning light, I realize I didn't just defend a piece of property. I defended the peace I waited my whole life to find. So if you ever find yourself up against someone who tries to push you out of what's rightfully yours, remember this. There's a strength in quiet certainty, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. And if there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Stand your ground with quiet strength, and never let someone else's title make you doubt your truth. Dignity, respect, and justice aren't given. They're claimed, one calm decision at a time. If you felt something watching this story, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life when you had to fight for what was right, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell notification to all, and give this video a like. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below. Your voice matters here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.